Welcome back. So have you ever thought about how the medication that you take gets approved for public use? Every year, thousands of people in Canada and in the US participate in experimental drug trials for money. Bodies for Rent is an investigative documentary that follows 2 of those participants over a 12-month period. Take a look.
I led companies to test medications on me in exchange for money. The very first time I remember being very afraid. If I had any doubts, I was thinking, I need to pay my rent.
We're thrilled to have the director here with us today. Please welcome 3-time Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, Habiba Nosheen. It's nice to have you back with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, Habiba, it's such a fascinating documentary. And let's just dive in, because for 1.5 years, you followed 2 men, Franco in Canada and Rain in the US. So talk about how this film, the idea even came to be, and how did you cast them?
Yeah, the team at the Investigative Journalism Bureau, which is a nonprofit newsroom, came to me about 2 years ago and first told me about this, and I was like, oh my God. I take medications, my family takes medication. I'd never thought about who are the people who do this and why are they doing this? So they had been studying this from a public health perspective, and we teamed up, and for the last 2 years, that's sort of been what I've been diving into. It was hard, to be honest, to get people to do a documentary with you. We talked to more than a dozen people, and the funny thing I learned is they're actually quite ashamed of what they do.
Oh.
And in one case, you know, there's a guy who said his family thinks that he is a drug dealer because he goes away, comes back with lots of money, and he's like, I'd rather my family think I'm a drug dealer than I sell my body testing drugs.
Wow.
So that's sort of kind of the space you're talking about. So one of the things we did is we worked with an amazing makeup artist, and we disguised the identity of one of our participants who wanted to tell his story, wanted to tell the truth, but he is in a very vulnerable situation, and this is how he makes his livelihood. So that allowed us to give people the comfort and to be able to tell their story without compromising their identity.
Right.
Well, let's talk about that livelihood, because that was the most eye-opening thing. I thought people just who were on the cusp of dying would go into these trials.
Right.
These are like serial testers, right?
Yes.
How much do they make?
They could make a lot. In Canada, the most I saw was upwards of 20,000, more than 20,000 for one drug trial.
Oh,
and you can
interesting.
do multiple.
Okay. Wow.
And this one would take Franco about 6 months to get the whole money.
Okay.
And in the US, I saw one for $50,000. One of the ones that Rain did recently, it was for $30,000 for 2 months. So if you're struggling to make ends meet, you can't get a minimum wage job, this seems like a viable solution. I can absolutely understand that.
Okay, but the flip side of this is like, what kind of health risks are these participants like putting on the line by participating?
I think when you're having to make decisions about paying your rent and not having enough food, getting this kind of cash just makes sense for some people.
And they don't mind if they get hurt?
They do get hurt. There was one incident where Rain was in a drug trial, and he tells us that he got so sick that he couldn't stand, he couldn't pee, he needed help. And that, it's the first time a drug is going into a human.
Right.
Imagine, like anything could happen. And the consent forms that most of these people sign kind of say, if something happens to you, you're on your own, and that's the risk they're taking.
Wow. So one of the subjects described, they're participating in these trials is almost like being in jail, because they're trapped somewhere for a set amount of time. There's like tons of cops around, surveillance. But before people volunteered and were paid to do drug trials, they were actually done in prisons.
Yes.
Can you talk to us more about that?
Yeah, that's one of the things we learned in investigating this, that in Canada and the US, until the 1970s, phase 1 trials, which is healthy people trying a drug for the first time, was done in prisons in both Canada and the US. They were paid like, a little bit of amount of money, but we were testing. And the one thing that really broke my heart was Johnson & Johnson's no-tear shampoo. That was tried on inmates in prisons in the US that left so many inmates deformed.
Wow.
And just, you would never think of that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right, that somebody had to try that formulation before it became perfect for us to not have tears.
So, okay, so people, we learn in the documentary, people sometimes have to lie to get into trials because there's certain parameters, like they have to be a certain weight or they have to be a certain age. So talk about the lengths people will go to get into a trial.
Yeah, one of the things about the film is like the honesty with which people share how they get in. You need to have a certain type of weight, and Franco in the film tells us he struggles to keep his weight down, like many people do, and he really needs the money. So he has taken this like herbal tea, Chinese tea that makes you drop, like have crazy diarrhea and makes you drop like something like 4 kilograms a weekend just to pass the screening test. And in the most desperate situations, he has told us that he's done meth. And he would do meth that would make him lose the weight so he can get in accepted.
Wow.
And he chooses meth because it only stays, according to him, it only stays in your system for up to 5 days. And then when he does the drug testing at the facility, it comes
back clean.
Doing drugs to have to be in a drug trial, like that whole thing is just mind-boggling. One other thing that really stood out to me is that people, including Rain and Franco, they have to downplay their symptoms. So they're not actually, the point is testing the efficacy, but we're not getting the real information. Why are they doing that?
Well, they told us that when they start doing this, they learn pretty quickly, if you tell them that, oh, okay, the medication you gave me is giving me migraines or any kind of side effects, you get kicked out of the drug trial and you don't get the money which you're there for in the first place. Nobody's doing this from their perspective. They tell us nobody's doing this because of good of science. They just need the money. And if they're telling you that they have side effects and you're gonna kick them out and they won't get the money, they just say, we just don't tell anybody we're having any side effects.
Oof. So how real are the results then?
Some things can be found out with lab results, right? Or they can find, because they are doing lab work consistently to check that. But if there are things like migraines, say you're hallucinating, those things you can hide. So things that can be hidden, they do their best to not disclose them.
So I'm going to say the opposite. It feels like the system is broken. If people testing the drugs are lying in order to stay in the trial, and then the people putting the drugs out aren't getting the actual side effects correct, this is bad.
This is bad.
So do you see any solution to this?
You know, the way our regulatory system was actually devised was when, after the prisons, we moved to doing them at universities. And we kind of thought, okay, there's some bunch of professors, some doctors at University of Toronto or British Columbia or wherever, we can trust them. They can monitor themselves. So our regulatory system around human participants in drug trials kind of came out of this idea that they were being done in universities and we can leave them alone and kind of have this pseudo-regulatory system. But since the 1990s, it's kind of moved at rapid pace to the private sector. And the regulatory system around it is still a leftover from when we were having them done at universities. So our system just hasn't caught up to the fact that these are now being done in private clinics all around the country.
Oh my God, this is eye-opening to say the least. Habiba, thank you for joining us and
Thank you.
shedding some light on this for the rest of us. Unbelievable. We want to tell you that Bodies for Rent premieres tonight on CBC.
Hey you, come a bit closer. We've got so many more must-see interviews, spicy debates, lifestyle tips, and pop culture moments. So subscribe to our channel by tapping the logo below and don't miss out.